Peace, y'all. It is I, the Emma Energy Master Allah. And as you know, it's February. We're coming to the end of Black History Month. So if you saw the title, I wanted to get into some prehistory of Black God. And what does that even mean? So, first and foremost, we teach that we, the original people, we write our history in advance. It's not something that's done in retrospect as a description, but rather it is a building of the framework that will determine how events unfold in a recursive manner over the course of the next 25,000 years. Now, I know that sounds like a uphill, out of the park claim, but I guarantee I got receipts. Whether or not I'm able to get to all of them now in the time I have is one thing or another, but it doesn't even matter. If you need more context for certain things, you can always go on Amazon, grab my book, The Leopard in the Mirror, Canticle of the Mutant Guardian. You can look at it for under my government name, Stavario Wyndham, or you can look it up as Energy Master Allah. Either way, you should get those results on there. Okay, now before I get into it, I had a request by my man's Ryan to go ahead and break down the meaning of my universal flag necklace that came in the mail the other day. So for those of you who don't know, I got knowledge of self back in 2019 from Allah See God, who got it from I True Self of Knowledge God's Tree. You don't have to be a 5%er or anything like that in order to understand, grasp, and take something of value from what I'm about to say. It doesn't matter which of the 5 human families of planet Earth that you belong to. We all have a shared universal story. And then I'm not here to necessarily provide new information so much as to give you the tools you need in order to integrate all the information in order to see what it's all pointing at. One of my favorite quotes by Bruce Lee is if I point at the moon, if you stare at the finger, you're going to miss all that heavenly glory. You know what I'm saying? So don't get wrapped up in the pointers, but try to see what they're pointing at. But anyway, so as far as the universal flag goes, from a superficial standpoint, the universal flag is that black, white, yellow flag and this symbol that you see with respect to the gods. But what it actually describes is the very structure of not just the physical universe, but the nature of reality itself, and how physical reality is manifested, or you could say projected, from unmanifest potential. That's the most simple explanation I can give for that. I should say if so the Leopard in the Mirror book is designed to give you some context. So if you're somebody coming from the outside in, it gives you some context that kind of helps you navigate the Eurocentric world that we've been subjected to, and the way that they utilize language to try to describe ideas versus the inherent way that we present a geometry for concepts. That's a higher dimensional approach to presentation and extraction of information. It's all about the way the universe stores memory and is able to regenerate itself from that, right? And so we have to do a big process of translating the way that we store, create information in the beginning versus the way that our English language has manifested now, because it's essentially a clusterfuck with regards to trying to describe things that our ancestors and ancients were describing, and then because we take things literal instead of understanding how they encoded information to last for thousands of years in the form of myth, we often get confused. And then that goes for everything across the board, whether it be religious text, whether it be more recent movements like Black Islam in America. It's all coming from a like source. And what I'm hoping to do here and in all of my work basically give you the tools to see the bridges that bring all of us together. Because at the end of the day, the goal is peace. Speaking of which, peace, I see you, Janelle. All right. So anyways, universal flag. All right. So there's some key components on there. So things that you may notice, you may immediately notice the 7 stands out, of course. You've got the 8-pointed star. And if you look a little bit closer there, each one of those triangles is divided into 2 for a total of 16 triangles. I'll explain that in a moment. You of course notice the star and crescent, which is very common in Islamic flags and things of that nature. And then you've got the circle that's around all that. Okay, so I'll get into all of that. Once again, as 5%ers, we teach that Islam is a way of life, a natural way of life, and not a religion. Religion means to bind again to, but then we'll basically teach you that you never left in the first place. It's just a matter of remembering. All right, so let me start with, where do I want to start? Let's go ahead and start with this, with the 7. Okay, so if you know anything about supreme mathematics, 7 is Allah, God, and the supreme mathematics. And then according to that definition, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that, because there's the way that you understand the word God based on your on the connotation that you've been conditioned with in modern times. But as far as the way that we define it, we say that that the black man is God, Allah is God, always has been, always will be. The definition gets into the all I sing, the all, and all is 360 degrees. And it continues on by saying God is the wise man's equality. This is to build or destroy. None of that means anything to you unless, of course, you have knowledge of self. If you've already learned the supreme mathematics, if you've already learned the supreme alphabet. So already right there, we've got an issue, because we have what's called nuance and initiation. So for most of the text that you read, and I think I'm pretty sure most of my viewers, you're coming from a black Christian context. Most of the things that you understand with regards to spiritual language are in biblical terminology, and even that is only in English biblical terminology. So with the Bible in general, you're dealing with Greek, you're dealing with Aramaic, you're dealing with Hebrew semantics that are way older than the English that you're using now. And so a lot of it does take some initiation, some nuance. It takes being taught by the traditional holders of that knowledge what exactly they meant when they said it. Even Jesus told his disciples that there was a version that he gave information to people in the public, like he would tell stories and use metaphor and whatever else, and then he would pull them aside and he would break it down a little further, right? He'd give them the science behind it. But anyways, so that number 7. Now, and then mind you, this is not the ground level basic version that you would get from anybody with knowledge of self. So this is plus degrees. Let me go ahead and say that we call that plus degrees. So anything that you learn to add additional context to what's provided discreetly in the lessons is what we call plus degrees. So that can include what you learn in college. That can be what you learn from other research, but all the things that you bring in order to help clarify the conversation. And so that said, that 7, as you can see, the shape of that 7, it has 7 sides to it in order to show that it is not just an abstract concept of 7, but then being able to actually visualize the geometry associated with 7, and by that means understanding the archetype of 7. So an archetype is essentially you can think of it as a template. You can think of it as, for example, the common thread between there being 7 colors in the rainbow, there being 7 musical notes in the main scale, all of these places where you have 7 days in a week. The science behind it deals with relative wavelength. And that's to say that there are 7 distinct qualities in our reality, in our universe, that even though you can get into any huge level of detail and mix these up in any number of ways, you can make a billion songs out of the same seven notes. The underlying kit, the underlying ingredients that we're able to discern from one another, there's seven key elements. So just keep that in mind. And so the word seven in Hebrew is sheva. Sheva is how that's transliterated. That is the same. That comes from the same archetypal root as Shiva, the god that you hear about in Hindu. It is the same archetypal root that is associated with Queen of Sheba, um, with whose name also means oath. So keep that idea of oath, covenant in the back of your mind, because that's what brings you to the rainbow covenant of Noah. So we've got that idea of the rainbow with its seven colors combining with that concept of the oath and the covenant. Okay, so these are all the same concept being told in different stories in different ways to help you understand the same one concept. That same root is at the root of Shabazz. So if you're familiar with the stories of the tribe of Shabazz in Nation of Islam, it's the same thing. And in fact, if you listen to the story that's told of the origins of the tribe of Shabazz, and it gets into some mythological sounding type stuff with regards to the division of the earth and moon, and it gets into some stuff about the tribe of Shabazz breaking off and going into the jungles of Africa where we adopted our quote unquote Negro features. Like, it gets into some stuff where on the surface it just sounds like some wild mythology, but once you actually understand the science behind what they're encoding in there, that's where we get into the prehistory of black God. But just understand that's the seven. All right, so behind this seven, you see the crescent and the star. And so this is what connects at least the symbolism to the rest of Islam and whatnot. But that the crescent alone, it's actually a bit older, and it is associated with very old concepts of the feminine. It is one of the symbols of the earth, who is known as Allah, ALA, in Igbo spirituality. So Igbo spirituality is called Odinala, Odinala, Allah meaning earth. It is also Allah. She could also be called Ani, Ani, or Ana, Ana. So if you see any combination of those, that's what it's talking about. So even though they were swept and down, there's no direct correlation between Allah, ALA, as the earth, and Allah, ALLAH. Through the sciences that we teach, that 5-point star represents our 5-point body design. So the 5 parts that we identify: arm, leg, arm, head. That is an acronym that is embedded in Allah. We're not saying that was the original intention of their word, but it was the way that it needed to be clarified so that our people, once we got the information, could get it in the correct hidden form. All right. And so, as you can see, the star, which is also a symbol of the child, not just the physical child, but the child archetype. So that applies to Jesus and any other similar archetype where you have a being whose job is to connect heaven and earth, be the translation between the two. That's called the child archetype, and that's symbolized by a star. Because it is nested in this way within the crescent moon, this represents a mother with child. So whereas in general we would call the women the moon, you can look at the moon as a hollow earth or whatever, and so we call a mother earth. So what makes her earth is that she houses a star, and this taps into an even deeper science of the way that we unfold. If you think about it, your 5-point star looking form, it unfolds from the equivalent of a dot or a seed. Because when your mother and father get together, and then that thing he got mixes with that thing she got, or whatever, it creates a single cell called a zygote. Zygote. All right. And then from that zygote, you unfold into that star form. So that archetypal process is repeated throughout the universe in just about every form you can think of. But more specifically, you have what's called the Schumann resonance and other frequencies that come from the earth itself, and it interacts with our atmosphere through lightning strikes to create a certain resonance that is the same frequency as your brain waves. And that is no accident. That is the reason why you have conscious thought in the first place, because consciousness is everywhere. But you got to kind of trap it in a container in order for you to experience it as individuals. So even right there, peace, Dobe Arts in the building, Carl Gray in the building, peace. So even within that explanation, you kind of understand why there's life on Earth, but not Earth, like not necessarily life as we know it, just floating around throughout space. So the same way, the reason that you have a conscious experience of being one person, one individual, is because that collective consciousness is trapped within, and I don't want to use the word trap because you're not in prison, but it's enclosed within your body structure so that you can experience yourself as an individual. And so that same word, that enclosure or whatever, is it appears in biblical speech as house or head in some cases, because the word so resh, the letter resh, which is in Bereshit, which is the Hebrew version of in the beginning or in the head, is basically encoded in a lot of the key mythological archetypes that are found in the Bible, including the so Bathsheba's whole name means either house of seven or daughter of the earth of the oath. So even right there, you can see a semantic meaning that links women to the concept of housing something in. This has all to do with the process of housing a child within the womb or whatever. You'll find that a lot of these descriptions are highly centered around the process by which the first woman who gave birth to a modern human did that. So whereas we're just looking at these stories as recent history, it's basically the history of everything that could possibly happen in humanity written before we ever even came into existence. And if in fact, if you think that's just something I'm saying, it is a common feature in all of the major religions. In Judaism, the priest will tell you that the Torah was written 2,000 years before creation. All right, and that sounds crazy, but I guarantee it's going to make a lot more sense in a minute. In Hinduism, they have what's called the Vedas, and the word Vedas just means knowledge. But they say that it has always existed in a energetic or vibratory form, and the yogis of olden times, they just had to tap into it, and then that's how they got the information for the written Vedas. If you're thinking that's just on some mysticism stuff, it's also in Islam, whereas the Quran, it explicitly talks repeatedly about a hidden book of the Quran which existed with Allah first before it was ever written and transmitted into this reality. So it's not just one culture or one religion that's saying this; everybody is saying this. And I'll get into exactly what that is in a couple moments. But that's basically the science of the seven, the star, the moon, and why it's enclosed in this circle. Now, you can't see the colors that are used for this right now in my necklace, but the seven is always black because for obvious reasons. Yep. But then that background, that circle, even though the circle itself represents the sun, and then you have the 8 points outside of it that's representing those rays coming off of it, the circle itself, it's a white circle because that white circle represents the clouds. Now, understand that you'll have to understand the context of America back when these lessons first arrived. So you could really take it back to the transmission of the information brought by Noble Drew Ali in the early 20th century with regards to the Circle 7 Quran. You can look that up on your own time. And within his descriptions, you can kind of more discreetly see the bridges between what we were teaching black people around that time and what was being taught in India and Tibet, because everybody was black up until around at the earliest you started having groups that were always like lighter. You started having that more so around 50,000 years ago, which is the exact time frame that the story of the tribe of Shabazz talks about when people split up, which is interesting how well it connects with the actual anthropological history. But in terms of an actual what we would call a white or Caucasian archetype, that is extremely new, occurring around 4000 BC. And it's no coincidence that Bishop James Ussher, in his calculation of how old the world is based on the biblical the clues that are in there, he calculated it to be 4004 BC. But that was not the beginning of the entire world or the entire universe. That was the beginning of that white archetype. So that was around the exact same time that the HERC2 gene mutation, so HERC like Hercules, HERC2 gene mutation occurred, that where blue eyes started to appear. And in another part of the world around Scandinavia, you started having the lighter skin become more common, and these two phenotypes were completely separate. It wasn't just one type of person that popped out. These were intentional processes that had to happen in order to bring these two phenotypes together. In the middle, around Greece and the Aegean, they say Turkey is where it emerged, but that's more so the blue-eyed part. But those people were still brown skinned. But when you talk about what we look at as a white person today, that happened closer to the Aegean, Greek, around in that region, as the Yamnaya spread. These are the descendants of Japheth, if you want to get biblical with it. But they are also the ancestors of the corded ware, all of these types of groups that lead to what we think of as a European today. All right. So anyway, so the cloud isn't simply just to talk about all them folks over there cloud and what the Black Seven trying to do. No, that's just kind of how we shaped that, because it made sense in the 60s when most of this was getting really, really popular. And then the point of these teachings are to be relevant to your particular time. So it doesn't matter if it's what you're dealing with right now in America, or if it is what humans were dealing with 100,000 years ago. The same underlying architecture is what is supposed to be used in order to make your myths and your other information in order to help you survive on this planet. All right, but that said, that idea of the white clouds is actually the key to understanding what we mean when we say that the universe is a hologram. We're not saying that it's some fake computerized matrix type thing. What holographic means is that the information of the whole picture is contained in every single one of the parts. All right. And so even within saying that, you can already kind of see how this concept of God is in everything, where that comes from. It's literally a description of a holographic reality where every single part contains the entire information of the whole. So right then and there, this is why every one of these belief systems out here tell you to look within for the truth and the answers. To give you a more discrete reason as to why that is, it's because through the divine spark, which I will describe a little bit further momentarily, the divine spark that exists within you can be seen as an arrow that points all the way back to its source. All right. So it's a direct arrow back to the source. Now, everything that's in the material world points back to source, but it's a matter of your ability to translate how that thing translates back to source. So even within the Black Islam context of God and devil, one thing that's always acknowledged, especially when it comes to the 5%, is that because there's this thing that describes them as the skunk of the planet Earth, but then within those same lessons, it tells that they were born from us or whatever. So if the father of a puppy is a dog and the father of a cub is a lion and so on and so forth, if the child is a skunk, what does that make the parent? So Allah threw that threw that ideology out because it blocks the conversation of peace and understanding. It doesn't mean kowtowing or bowing to somebody else. What it means is recognizing that what you dislike is the fact that your children are misbehaving, because we also teach that we're the original people of the planet Earth. And even though that was contested back when these things were first being taught at the beginning of the 20th century with Noble Drew Ali, and then they were reiterated through Master Fard and Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and then passed on to Clarence 13X, who became Allah, and then it got woven into the hip hop through cats like Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, and Wu-Tang. Regardless of when, it was still the same message that that we're the original people of the planet. And then this was finally confirmed with the findings that happened between 1960 and 1969 in both Ethiopia and in Morocco, and have been, bringing receipts ever since. All right, because before that time, the thing they were teaching your kids in school, your kids and our kids alike, they were teaching that all humans came from European Neanderthals, and that the white people were first, and then some of them got cursed and became black people. That is completely inaccurate, and they found out for sure in the 1960s. So it was no coincidence that all of the civil rights stuff and all of that started to be able to pass and become concrete. Like, I know you want to credit all of that success to just the marching and whatever else that they teach you in school now, but the main reason was that it became undeniable at that point that them folks had very much mistranslated the scriptures that they were basing their laws on, and it turns out that the descriptions were leaning a little more toward, something along the lines of these black folks may be a little more than what they've given credit. I'll just leave it at that. Now, to get to the 8 points of the star before I move on to the main prehistory lecture. So the 8-point star, you can link it if you want to the concept of the Dingir star in Sumerian cuneiform. So this was the symbol that they would put before all of the names of the so-called gods. That's not what they call them, but that's the word we lump everything into in English. But this was a star that appeared before their names to let you know that that's what they were. Now, what that Dingir star actually is, it's no different than how I have Allah at the end of my name. So it just simply shows that I am aware of my connection back to source, and that we are one and the same. I am a single expression of that. I'm no different from you. All of us have that within us, but it's just a matter of whether or not you remember it, you awaken it, and you take responsibility for it. So by me declaring that, by me taking that name, Energy Master Allah, I'm supposed to live into that. And that's exactly what I've done. My name is an acronym for energy manifesting and showing the truth of Allah, which basically means I don't just come out here and preach some stuff or reiterate something that somebody else said. I have to dig and present to you the burden of proof that these statements are something that is true and applicable. So it's easier for humanity as a whole to get to a place of peace if we stop living in a paradigm of, is this right or is this wrong, because if all things come from the same source, nothing is wrong per se, but it's just a matter of how much time and energy do I have to invest in examining and understanding something to discover what does it take, what is missing that would make this thing true. So it's not that something is false so much as how much work do I have to do and what information is missing that will make this thing true. And then that, if you allow that to guide your studies, your research, even your religion and the way that you love people in your life, understanding is key. We say peace is supreme understanding for the benefit of the whole. And that is because in order for you to love something, you have to understand it. And then in order for you to understand it, you have to be able to separate the meanings that you have conditioned for yourself of things versus what is the inherent underlying meaning, regardless of what you think about it. Okay. And so that will always give you a pathway to truth. Now, those 8 points, like I said, they're broken down into 16 parts. And so on the surface level of that basically represents the age by which you're usually expected to be able to teach this stuff. So a lot of people, like even like you think about like RZA, Wu-Tang, like all kind of people, they have at least the basics with regards to the supreme mathematics, supreme alphabet, the lessons, all that. They have that more or less mastered by the time they're 11. But then you have those 5 extra years where you can actually be out there experiencing it, applying it, gaining the wisdom around it. And then by the age of 16, you should be building your own crew, you know what I'm saying, your own disciples that you're teaching. Speaking of which, shout out, peace to my disciple. Her love is born divine up in Macon, Georgia. Master Allah C. So if you're in that area and then you want to find an enlightener, holla at HUD. If you're down around the Gifford, Vero Beach, Florida area or whatever, holla at me, Energy Master Allah. You can pretty much find me through the Gifford Historical Museum if you want to reach out, or you can reach out on here on Facebook. But anyway, but the deeper knowledge behind that 16 is associated with every single divination system in Africa. And whereas most of us have been taught that is just some witchcraft, some nonsense like this, it is the basis. And I repeat, and I reiterate this, every single form of computing on the planet is rooted in African divination. That is not just a wild claim. I could get into the math in just a few moments, but essentially they worked out the understanding of there being relative space between numerals and the role that plays in quantum mechanics. They worked that out long ago in an experiential form. And even though it wasn't until more recent times among Hindus and Arabs that our numeral system was further defined, what they were doing was just a rediscovery and a clarification. That is not the same as inventing something. And so this gets into some things I will get into shortly as well, whereas you had the first people on the planet who just naturally had this knowledge because we were fresh out of the spiritual realm. So once you're incorporating and incarnating into the physical plane or whatever, you have all that information embedded in you, and you have various ways that you attempt to draw that information out of you. But then it's taken thousands of years for us to reach this point where we can articulate that in the form of sciences and math and all of that stuff. So what you're calling physics and everything else is just the descriptive language that helps to clarify what we already contain within us in the form of raw data. They're still trying to figure out how to read DNA. DNA is a code that contains everything about you, but then they're still learning how to read it because once again it was written in a language that's slightly higher dimensional and that isn't as compatible with the way that we use language in this kind of flat version here. But all the bits and pieces, the DNA is still within all of that language, which is why I'm even able to have a conversation with you about that. But in a nutshell, that is the higher breakdown. There's still so much more I could say about this, but we've got to get into the main lecture. But if you missed any part of that, go back, read it, check it out. But that's not what we came here to do. Let's get into it. The prehistory of Black God. Let me flip this camera right quick, because I've got the laptop up. I've got a board. I put as much as I could on the board as possible. Remember, you can always take screenshots if necessary. There's the name of the book if you want to grab that or whatever. There's a couple people on here right now already got copies of this or whatever. So I appreciate y'all. If you dig it, go ahead and start teaching somebody else something. And if you need more information or anything, you can always hit me up. Like, you already a part of the tribe, you already part of the clan. If you got the book, and then I'll build with you. All right, so there we go. Prehistory of Black God. So the first thing that we had to clear up is this baggage around God. And then you see this word above it, etymology. Etymology should be your best friend. So if you are going to, especially if you're someone who believes in the word of God, you have to understand the word God, because the whole concept of word, it isn't just simply these things I have written on the board, but it is literally the process, the mechanism that allows the unmanifest potential of the whole to translate into all the little individual forms of matter that we see in our physical world. Now, before I continue, you may be asking yourself, energy, like what does this have to do with my life today? What does this have to do with my bills and this, that, and the other? Well, the problem is you don't realize that those bills and those jobs, they are tied to an economy that is driven by laws that were built based on people who understood what I'm teaching you right now, and it understood how to keep you trapped within that system without having to use chains. They keep you wrapped up in language. If you go into any courtroom or whatever, you'll find that all the laws, they're named with Latin. So if you don't have an understanding of the nuance of Latin or whatever, you can't even be a lawyer. And if you can't be a lawyer, how can you make the deals that you need? You're always relying on somebody else. And in the what we teach, we have these 9 items that are central to what we teach in the 5%. The 5th degree of that, it says straight up, it said we teach that the science of education should teach our people how to be self-sufficient. And so self-sufficient doesn't mean simply going out working and feeding yourself. What it means is you should have the ability to where if all of this got shut down, which it will inevitably do, because we have certain solar cycles that happen every few thousand years, that basically shut down the entire electrical grid. And what that means is humanity could have easily, but just look at how much the world has changed from, let's just say, the year 1914 to 2014, where we've got smartphones, where just a few years ago, the only phones you had were them big old cord phones at your grandma's house, right? So if all of that can happen in under 100 years, you could imagine if you had 1,000 or 10,000 years of uninterrupted time to develop as human beings, you would have built up past this several times. But what tends to happen is that with those developments of society, we also tend to develop what you call hubris, which is it's akin to arrogance. But at the end of the day, it basically comes down to not fully understanding the consequences of our technology as we get more intimate with the processes of electricity and combustion and things of that nature, because those same exact things are central to the way our body and existence as a whole operates. So you're basically knocking on the door of God, if you will. And if you're not properly aligned, it's the equivalent of like a lightning rod. Like if you're not compatible with the information or the energy that's coming in, it can cause a short circuit. It could burn out your system, right? And so this is why I spend such a large amount of time on making sure that you're clear on the source of these words, because at the end of the day, every word that you speak has a vibration to it. And that's not on some esoteric, mystical stuff. I'm saying, if you were to, cause I work in audio. So a lot of you know that I've been in music since I was like 15 years old. And so through audio engineering, there's several tools that you could use to where you can actually see the shapes of the sound waves that, are being produced by either the instruments or by your own voice. And what I'm saying is there's a distinct shape of sound associated with every word. So regardless of what you mean versus what somebody else means when they say that word, the underlying vibration of it will still be the same. And then that is the thing that actually interacts with the physical universe. And so understanding that concept alone cuts through most of the fat when it comes to trying to figure out what this stuff means beyond opinion, because that is the key thing that stands between us and peace and stability on this planet, is that everybody thinks that their opinion is God, but that's not the end all be all. That's not the supreme. Supreme doesn't mean better. It means that which is where you can't go any further. Where's the point where you couldn't possibly divide or dissect something with your intellect, because you end up with the substance that is contained in all things. All right. So let's get into it. All right. So God. So we're going to come over here. We're over here on Wiktionary.org, and you need to make this your best friend. I know a lot of y'all love Wikipedia, but Wiktionary breaks down words, their origins. You get to see some of the phonemes, which is the parts of speech and the sounds that help to make up these words. And then when you trace those, you can easily start to see how a word that meant one thing got divided into all kinds of different meanings once people spread out from each other and started only having conversations among themselves instead of checking in with their neighbors who they may not have known existed, because you had several periods in human history where we all got separated due to glacial events, weather events, floods, different things of that nature that had us isolated in certain areas, to where after a few generations, some people, they thought that the people around them were the only people on the planet. So a lot of it, so we've been around and then some, and just had to rebuild several times. And so you'll find by the time I'm done with this conversation that most of the figures that pop up in history and end up being called gods are people who essentially were the carriers of the knowledge from the previous civilization that had been wiped out and destroyed. And so they played the role of helping civilize humanity again. So people that based without their electrical grid, without all of their comforts of society. Most of you right now, there's some of y'all can't cook. It's like your idea of cooking is calling up or hopping on your app and dialing DoorDash or whatever. So just imagine people who have never had to lift a finger, and you know which people those are. Imagine them having to be thrown into a world that has no electricity anymore, none of the comforts that we had. You basically be like a caveman at that point, right? And so, especially if there was a flood or something that washed away all of your nice buildings and whatever else. And so you're looking for shelter, you wind up in caves. And so it's not even that you had, that's not to say that there wasn't a stage of humanity where we didn't, know things and the world was new and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm saying is you probably had cave situations, that are in our recorded history that were preceded by high civilization situations where it was just a matter of people not anticipating the cycles and not listening to the stories of the elders who were caught off guard by these long cycles that only happen like every 25,000 years or whatever. And then as a result, the entire civilization gets wiped out. They got to start back from the baseline. And then those people who come to teach them the knowledge of the previous civilizations are usually looked at as gods. And then as time progresses, because the people at the start of those cycles didn't really have the language to describe those beings, it ends up getting generalized. And over time, these people get elevated to an entirely higher status, or whatever you may think, whatever a god ends up meaning, that's usually why. But what you'll also find is, as I strip these meanings down and demystify them a little bit, once you get down to the root of it, you start to realize the entire universe is more mystical than you thought. It's just that we remove the mystery. So you can be mystical without being shrouded in the cloud of mystery. And that's your quotable for the month. All right, so let's get into it. All right, so etymology of God. It says inherited from Middle English God, from Old English God, originally neuter, which means that it didn't have a gender on it, but then changed to masculine to reflect the change in religion to Christianity. From Proto-West, it's originally from Proto-West Germanic God, a noun which came from Proto-Germanic Gouda. See there for further origin. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go here to Gouda real quick. All right. So this is where the juicy stuff comes in. All right. So first off, you will be amazed at how many, like I'm talking about the top linguists in the world, they get to Proto-Indo-European and they start saying stuff is unknown. Now I can tell you right now, even though they say Sumerian is a what they call a language isolate, they act like it just popped up out of nowhere around 4000 BC. The fact of the matter is that it is a descendant from West African languages. The problem is that because there was a tendency in Proto-Indo-European languages to either have letters that can swap, for instance, whereas you have certain words that begin with H in a Vestan language, those became words that start with S in the Sanskrit language that is used to make like all the Hindu texts, right? So if you are unfamiliar with these rules, then you tend to make assumptions that Africa ain't have nothing to do with nobody. But at the end of the day, our language system, it didn't just have a bunch of extra letters for no reason. It was anticipating the fact that y'all were going to do this right here. But that said, let me continue. All right. So it says traditionally drawn from Proto-Indo-European guton, either meaning that which is invoked, from gu meaning to call, to invoke. So we're already dealing with sound and voice, or libated, poured as part of a liquid offering, from gu to pour. So in the context of Hebrew, when you're talking about the letter dalet, there's semantics and nuance associated with that associates pour, like you're pouring a cup, with being poor, like in your status, and also being a door. So there's a whole thing around that, and there's a deep biblical reason for that, but it is, it corresponds to the letter in Arabic, which means judge, which is the translation of the term Elohim. So Elohim, that's used for the God of creation in the beginning of the Bible, and that same judge etymology is found with respect to Pharisees. So the quote unquote judges that Jesus was getting into it with in his story, this is all the exact same concept, whereas judge had more to do with what you judge by. So this concept of pouring and spreading and strewing is tied into distribution, and it is a concept of, you could think of it as the one guy fractalizing so that each of the individual things in existence could exist. So it's not that there's something separate. It's just that they're pieces of the whole. And so this is where that distribution comes from. And so one of the Eastern concepts that found its way into the 5% in different words is this concept of Atman is Brahman, or it also appears as Jiva is Shiva, which is to say that the spark of divinity that is within you is the exact same as the divinity that sources all things. It's just that you're experiencing it as an individual experience. And so if you respect that, then, you don't really need outside sources. However, by comparing your physical self to all the physical things around you, you can find the common language that these things or these people are using in order to help you better understand the full existence of the source from which you come. So anyways, so from that pour, we have perhaps via the earlier meaning of libation made to an idol. So that word idol, there's a lot of baggage around that, but the word God that you're using or whatever, it actually comes from a word that can also mean idol, because all idol means is image, and then it says that made in the image of God, and we will get into a little more detail about what exactly that means, but that is explained a little better right here with this part that says spirit immanent in a burial mound. All right, and so that taps into this more. It's a concept that's slightly more understood in Africa, and then also understood in a different way in India. But every single thing in the physical universe, like even if you talk about atoms, for instance, everything in the physical universe is material that is inhabited by spirit. And to demystify the concept of spirit, it literally comes from spiritus in Greek, meaning breath. And if you understand that breath is not the air that you breathe, but the process by which that air comes in and out, it's circulation, it's recursion, it's repetition, it's cycle. That's what's meant by birth. And so anyways, it's talk about the means by which the information that informs your ability to hold your form, the way that it cycles. And so from a physics standpoint, what you're describing there would be a standing wave. So just like I was describing in the beginning, how you have this whole expression of the existence of God, but you as a body are designed to capture a small scoop of that and then have it bounce around within you long enough to where you can examine it. So that self-examination is you actually understanding more and more the nature of God and how you too are part of that same definition. All right. So the whole point of coming into this type of world, this physical existence, is to forget that and then put forth the effort to remember that it's a game that we play in existence. It's something that was determined before there was even such a thing as linear time, but we won't get too far into that without getting past it. So at the very basics, we understand, aside from what you mean or what you think you mean when you say God, this is the definition that they have. Now, if you look at some of the stuff down here at the bottom, you also get into a proposed Slavonic root having to do with revere, and revere is tied into praise and all of this. That actually gets into something that actually gets into that spread or strew or pour etymology right there, because and then I'm getting ahead of myself because it's going to be on the board, but the concept of to prostrate, you'll see that often in both the Bible and the Vedas, where they talk about prostrating, and we typically understand it to mean just bowing down, but it really means to spread out or lie flat. And I'll get into where that originates in a moment because it is important. So let's go to the board again. Okay, so now that we understand the concept of God, now we can start to understand the concept of Jesus, the Word, the Logos, the child archetype throughout mythology and in spiritual texts a little bit better. And the best way to start that conversation is to start with the Semitic root Nagur, which is Nun Gimel Resh. The Proto-Semitic language, that means what was before all of that, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic, what was before all that, and before there was those people, it was nothing but Africans. All right. And that was before it was even called Africa. You can get into semantics about it being called Asia before, or Kebulon, or whatever you want to, but then it is irrelevant in this conversation right here. Because if you don't understand that root right there, you can't understand the real reason why they call us Negro. Now, I know that a lot of y'all in the woke field, you will tie that to Negus as a word for king in Ethiopia. And while that is correct, it is the equivalent of you going into your backyard right now, digging a few feet, running into some ancient Indian arrowheads, and then running those to the museum, and then cashing those in, getting a nice little pretty penny for those arrowheads that you so proud of. But then the museum gets the rights to come and dig on your land, and because they have tools to dig a little further, they figure out what the arrows were shooting at in the first place, which was some dinosaurs. So you got some, if you would have dug about 20, 30 feet lower, which you weren't able to do, but they are, if you would have dug a little bit lower, you would have found the mammoth bones and the dinosaur bones that were down there, and you probably would have made millions, but you wanted to go get a pretty penny for the arrows. That's negus right here. The word negus is low-hanging fruit compared to this right here. All right. And so why is this root so important? It is because it is the source of the word nagar, which is the Aramaic word. And mind you, Aramaic was the language that Jesus used, because most people had forgotten how to use and interpret the original Hebrew language. But that is the word that is actually used in the Aramaic Bible for carpenter. So the word that you're interpreting as carpenter for Jesus's occupation in the Bible, that is not all that means at all. So the word that they use isn't just carpenter, but it can also mean author or creator. It can mean a number of things that have to do with shaping something newly. And so you don't necessarily have to be cutting wood in order to be that. Now, as you know, the New Testament was originally written in Greek. All right. So we had Jesus over here speaking Galilean Aramaic, whereas you had the Bible written in Greek. And so the word that they use is tecton. And if that sounds familiar, it's not by accident, because it is the same root as tectonic plates, which are the big plates on Earth that move around and change the shape of the planet. So this is the connection between Nagar that has to do with changing shape or making or creating. This is where you get all the stories about being made from clay. This is where you get any of that stuff that pops up in mythology or whatever. That's where it comes from. But tecton. And so as you can see right here, we're talking about the shaping of the earth. And in the beginning, I told you about the connection and the semantics between the pregnant woman and the earth or whatever. So this is why we call our women the earth, because the process that happens when you're forming a baby within you is a microcosm of the process that the earth uses to make people in the first place. It takes her a lot longer than 9 months to make people. It could take billions of years or whatever, but it's the same process sped up when you talk about making a person. In fact, and then I'll do this for you. I'm going to go and I'm going to pull up a picture of Pangea, which is the name of the supercontinent that there was before it broke apart. But I'm going to show you something that's fascinating. All right. So as you know, if you have kids, if you've looked at ultrasounds and all of that, you know that the baby, it turns its head downward before it gets ready to come out, because it's getting ready to fall up out that thing. right? Now, on these pictures of Pangea, so this is Pangea here. All right. Let me blow it up a little bit. This is one of my favorite pictures that comes up on Google because it breaks down like all the countries and where they were located and whatnot. All right. So the general thing I want you to look at is how similar this is to the shape of a fetus. All right. So when the molten material becomes exposed from the sea in the early formation of land on Earth, it doesn't just pop up randomly all over the place. It pops up in this one mass, and then it will break apart and then spread out. Like you can see the outline of Africa here. You can see where the United States will be, and South America nestled. This nestling of South America right here, tucked into Africa right here, is very important to understanding history from an archetypal standpoint, as opposed to looking at it as just a linear timeline. If you understand the way that both light and information operate outside of time, you realize that things can happen at any point in any location, but there's still key things that have to manifest in our planet in order for something like us as humans to be able to walk the planet. All right, so there's some higher dimensional chess going on there. But anyways, the key point I want you to take from this is how similar this is to a fetus in the womb. And then just to give you a control with that, let me see. So we'll say fetus in womb, just to get some geometrical coherence in my statement right there. So you see I ain't just talking nonsense. I want a real good one. So you can kind of see it right there, how he's folded up in there. I wish I had, let me see if we could get a good developing fetus. All right. Okay, you can kind of see, really right there. Okay, so you can see how with this 1 month old fetus, how the form is a little more ambiguous, where it isn't as defined as you see later down the line after about 6 months, where it's clear legs, clear arms, clear head. Right then, it's just this kind of shape. And then so if we take that and we look right back right here to Pangea, you see how you basically got the same kind of formation happening. So like I said, the earth gives birth to life in a very similar way, working from the top down, from the big down to the small. But one thing that is certain throughout the universe is that it doesn't come up with new stuff so much as it figures out all the stuff that it needs in the beginning, and then it finds a bazillion different ways to tell that exact same story. And then that's what ends up being manifested in the form of our literal stories here on planet Earth. So it starts out with a story being told by the actual planets and the objects, and then eventually you have something like a human that emerges that is able to translate those same stories into written form that we can use more easily and shape more easily using our minds and our voice. So we can have the ability to shape things in our head, be a Nagur, shape things in our head before we turn them into a physical project. And once you know how to build a house, you can figure out how to build a neighborhood. If you figure out how to build a neighborhood, you can build a town. Figure out how to build a town, you might be able to figure out how to build a state, build a country, build a country, build a continent, build a continent, build a planet, build a solar system, so on and so forth. So if you had enough time and you had enough resources and you weren't so busy fighting with each other all the time, you could probably figure out how to build an entire universe in a lab and create a little mini universe in a lab and have people in there who are sitting there having conversations about who created them, and they'd be talking about you. So this is very possible within theoretical sciences. All right. So once again, that same Nagur. So these 3 letters are probably some of the most flexible language. Flexible letters when it comes to the world languages, because you have languages where N and M are interchanged. So you'll find, especially in like India, between translation between Dravidian languages and Aryan languages, you'll find some interchange between N and M. In that same region, you will find interchange between G and K, and then all the stuff I'm saying, it applies a lot of times in Africa too. But then I get into a little bit more about how it works there. But anyway, so you'll see this interchange between G and K, and in fact, I learned Japanese on my own a little bit back in the day, but then I took a formal Asian humanities class back in college when I was at FAMU. And the way that you have the letter Ka, which becomes Ga with a G just by adding like a little mark to it. So it's basically telling you that's the same letter. It's just being inflected. And so similarly with M and N, we have this thing called nasalization. So you actually have a letter that is a combination of the N and a G, which describes the humming sound that you make in the noise after chanting Om. So Om, even though the surface spelling of it is just O-M, is broken down into the syllables A, U, which represent the solar plexus, the heart region, and the throat, respectively. So you're basically bringing a standing wave. Remember, I used that term earlier. You're bringing a standing wave up from the navel, up through the cavity of the body to chant Om. And then if you were taught properly, you'll know that noise is at the end so that you can vibrate the pineal and vibrate the skull. Why do you want to vibrate the skull? For the same reason I told you about that Schumann resonance that the planet makes with the atmosphere. Right? All right. So you're getting some deep science. You're getting college level shit right here just from just from some stuff that you thought was just slang in the Wu-Tang songs. All right. Okay. So this same so like we got into how the N and the M, so you can see how manger and all those words come about. Then G ends up becoming a K sometimes. And then R is switched between R and L. So these are all things that affect Asian languages in particular. So it's like they'll make fun of it on TV, but then there's a tendency for the R's to sound like L's over there. And that is actually found in Nigeria as well. And it's no coincidence that NGR is in Nigeria. It's all about the same root. And so this is where we also, so if you look at, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna bring this one up because you probably won't even believe me unless I show you straight up. Okay, so the etymology of the word angel. So have you ever wondered why all the angels' names end with L? So that L suffix is the same thing as that Dingir symbol before the Sumerian gods and whatever else. So angels weren't simply just messengers. That was something separate from God. Is actually the distribution thereof or whatever. So these are just aspects of that same one thing. All right. Once again, don't have to be super religious in order to understand linguistic studies and how it's been kicking y'all ass and been able to find solutions for the problems that have persisted among our people in particular. And then mind you, even though I have to go into great detail and explain lengthily in order for you to understand this here, we have like you look at those hieroglyphs in Egypt and places like that, we had all of this information packed into just a couple symbols. Like if you understood the symbol properly, you had the whole explanation right there. But then, that's not how we do language nowadays. So it's a lot more difficult. So anyway, so as you can see, the actual word that was used for angel in the Hebrew was malak. And then so this same, if you break it down to the root, the MLK, which should be a hilarious association that you might bring to Martin Luther King. So his last name is literally King, and his initials MLK, which aren't his original. Well, no, it was. He was just Marvin instead of Martin originally. But his initials MLK are literally the root that is also found in Persian, meaning king. So you can call it coincidence, you can call it conspiracy, whatever you want, but the fact of the matter is Martin Luther King's initials are the root for the word for king back during this time. All right, so Malak was the actual word. Now you ask yourself, well, where the hell did angel come from? All right, so let's look at the Greek. So we got angelos, which is the most broken down form that you see here. So they went through the Latin. So like I said, all of your laws, they come from Latin, but then the Latin is mostly taken from the Greek understanding of things, which means they were using biblical Greek. And then from there, the Greek is usually taken from Proto-Indo-European. But even more importantly, if you know anything about ancient Greece, you know how big of an influence the Mycenaeans had on early Greece and all of that. Now, as you can see, the Mycenaean version of that word is akero. So we already see where we have angelo on the Greek side with that NGR. They're using the ankelo. And so ankero or whatever, switching that L for the R, the K for the G, and so on and so forth. You actually have a root that's NKL instead of NGR, which means detestable, deplorable. And so that is the line of reasoning that they used in order to make nigger a negative connotation. So in other words, the same word that Negro and all of that comes from deals with angel. So if you've got this messenger aspect in your head, I'll be able to tell you how that translates and how we ended up with a bunch of white girls in dresses flying around with eagle wings instead of this concept of the black man being God. But it's all coming from this same stuff. I'm trying to tell you, this ain't stuff I'm making up. All right. Now, if you look down here further, breaking down of it, once you realize that this had to go through the Persian section of language development, meaning specifically a Persian mounted courier. So like your mailman, your deliverer, this is how some of this messenger semantic gets in there. And if you go a little bit older, you see that this has to do with contracts, with letter documents. More importantly, something inscribed into a tablet, a contract. The reason all of that is important is because in Odinala, in Igbo teaching, you have this concept called akaraka. And so what akaraka is, it is you can think of it as the universe took a snapshot at the moment of your creation and it folded that down, packing it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it became kind of the blueprint for how you would manifest on this planet. And so as a result of you unfolding from that little dot, that little seed form into that Allah 5-point star form that we mentioned earlier, that inscription becomes the markings on your skin. So as you can see, if you're not black or whatever, and you've never seen this or paid attention to this, we have specific lines that are darker than the rest of our hand that highlight which lines are important and associated with the instructions for our destiny. And so this is a 100,000-year-old concept that they refer to as akaraka, in AKA RAKA. Aka means hand or spirit, and there's a reason for that because spirit is an extension of your physical self. But akaraka is basically just saying this is the intention that you came into existence with. And so by you decoding the markings, the natural markings on your body, that is basically the first written word. And so I'm going to get into how that ends up becoming the Bible or the Vedas and whatever else later. But then at the very least, at this point in the conversation, you just need to understand that the original instructions, they exist before creation in vibratory form. But as far as the first way they're written in nature is on the human body. And so this is the reason why you had to have dark melanin on the first humans. So the first Homo sapiens had to be dark because there were written instructions on our body. Sounds crazy, but I guarantee you, as I break it down and show you the receipts, you'll realize, oh hell, is that what they've been talking about this entire time? All of these years? Oh my God, we've crusaded and inquisitioned so many people and killed so many Indians and black people and forced them to learn this, that, and the other, thinking that they were wrong and we were right. But nigga, we was here first. Come on, man. Come on. All right. So Angelo. So this is how we get into that. Now, if you are a little more versed in stories and myths and world religion and things of that nature, you may notice a similarity between this Ungar root and words like Naga. So Naga has come to mean mainly like a snake or a serpent or whatever else in Hindu mythology, so on and so forth. But if you take that back to the Hebrew word Nachash, which is the actual word used for the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that is distinct from the words that they use later on in the book for actual snakes. So you had a situation where you had actual snakes attacking the Israelites, and Moses had to put a nakash up on a post or whatever, made of brass, in order to for them to look upon and be healed. And so what that story is actually describing to you is the confusion between the words for the literal snake and the word for serpent. So serpent in Dogon and Egyptian symbolism in the secret societies and, you know, the underlying knowledge that they teach, the serpent is actually representing word or membrane. So remember those two things, word or membrane. So membrane is something that encloses something, and word is vibration. So we got this concept of something that holds vibration, which again brings us back to that idea of the standing wave being held in your body container. So all of this. And in this case, why black people though? Like, what was so important about melanin? Now, so let's get into a little bit of anthropology, geography. So for the record, you don't need dark black melanin in order to protect yourself from the sun. You do need reddish brown. So the way that San people look in South Africa is more or less what humans look like in general. Now, they did adopt a little more of the tightly coiled hair as we move further into the African interior, and from there they kept on going south. And you had like the previous stages of man before our modern humans, they had slightly straighter hair. And so this is why Cushitic people up in like East Africa, why they have curls, but not quite the coils that we have in the quote unquote Negro archetype, which we should start calling either the angel or the Naga archetype. And if you want to get nasty, that is the same place where we end up getting the Anunnaki stuff too, or whatever. But it's not as mystical as you probably think, but at the same time, it is a lot more in depth than we've been led to believe. But anyway, so those Cushitic people, they didn't quite have the curl all the way around. And as we move further south, the adaptations involved more so that, the changing of the hair so that we could retain moisture a little bit better and, be able to dissipate heat. But what you need for the sun is essentially a reddish brown color, which is more common. Now, let's get into the quote unquote Negro archetype, the dark skin, the wider nose, the stuff that we associate with us. This happened in the rainforests of Central Africa, which are right near the equator. And why is this important? Because there is a trend among all species on this planet where it isn't the sun that makes things black. It is earth radiation. So you may not have heard this anywhere. And it just was a breakthrough in my own research, where if you look up studies that they've done of Chernobyl, if you're not familiar with Chernobyl, it was one of these places in like the USSR who had a nuclear plant, a nuclear reactor breakdown, and the whole area was radiated, and the people were radiated, and the animals were radiated. And over time, the animals and the plants of that area, the mushrooms, all kinds of stuff like that, began to adapt to the higher levels of radiation. And one of the most common developments that happens is that they start to develop dark melanin. So you start having black frogs, black dogs, black everything you could think of, black on black on black. So this is one of the fun places where I get to get into some Black Panther stuff, but that is how Black Panthers came to be, or whatever, being in regions like this. It is not a coincidence that they called the superhero the Black Panther, because vibranium is a metaphor for the capabilities of uranium and thorium, which are two elements that are found in the soil along the equator in Africa. And so from Gabon on east into the Congo and on across, you have this highly radiative soil that had plants grow from it, and the animals ate the plants, and the people lived off of the animals and the plants in this area, and they adapted resistance to earth-based radiation. So the Negro archetype is unique, and this is where the joining of heaven and earth and the whole child archetype concept and the whole Jesus archetype and the Krishna, all of this stuff comes from the idea that because of the specific adaptations associated with equatorial people on the African continent, and something similar happened, but not completely, with the ones on the Indian continent, but I'll get into that in a moment. But Indian subcontinent, excuse me. But we adapted the ability to deal with both earth radiation and solar radiation. So we had a means to stabilize our physical form so that we didn't turn into new types of humans. You had like at least 3, 4, 5 different types of humans, more than that at some point. Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, all of these different types at some point, but we are the last man standing, Homo sapiens sapiens, or whatever, which is redundant, but that is the easiest way to kind of distinguish it for you. But anyways, we were the ones that were able to both be able to bring in solar radiation, which is information, where our bodies convert UV light down into infrared heat, which means it has to pass through the visible spectrum as it's interacting with our melanin, which means that we are the enclosure for the rainbow. So let me say that again. If our bodies convert high energy UV sunlight down into low energy, easier to process infrared light / radiation / heat / sound, because heat is stored in the body as what we call phonons, which you could think of as the sound equivalent of photons in light. So like, just like they say you have little particles of light called photons, particles, quote unquote, of sound, which you could just think of as, condensed sound, is stored as phonon/heat within the body. So thermal radiation, the movement of thermal energy, is the counterpart, I guess you could say, to the type of radiation and energy that is necessary in order to bring sunlight to the earth. So these are just two different ways to package the same thing. Okay, so but case in point, if your melanin is converting light from UV to infrared, that means that it is passing through the visible spectrum, which means all the colors of the rainbow within your body before it exits as heat. This is the same reason why on crude oil, whenever you see like oil spilled, you see that kind of rainbow looking color floating on the surface. This is why you see it do the same thing in crow's feathers. That is called iridescence. So iridescence is another way for light to be scattered. So you take that pure light and then you divide it into its spectrum so you can see what it's made out of. That is what we are. We are a spectrum of the light from which we originate. Okay. That just gets some conceptual stuff in there for you. All right. So, because of that, so that adaptation had to happen in order for us to allow the sun to mutate humans enough until we got to, the stage that we needed to be, where we could walk upright and have our 5 limbs and no tail and all of that good stuff. But then we needed a way to lock that in, and that is what melanin is. So melanin is what allows, our dark melanin is what allows us to keep the standing wave inside our bodies long enough to where that wave that we get directly from the Creator starts to inform magnetically the positioning of melanin on the surface of our skin, and we're able to read the information that is inside us outside. So whereas every human on the planet has forms of melanin inside their body in the form of neuromelanin, in the form of melanopsin is a variant of that, in the form of the substantia nigra, which is located inside the brain. Even though all humans have that, the reason you end up later with this language around the black man is God is because we're not simply the image of God, but we are the idol to which the information of that distribution is attached so that all people can know themselves. So we become the messenger. We become the human source, the son of man, if you will. This is where those terms come from. All right. So let's bring that to sky people. Okay, so Zulu, Ngoni, in just about every single variation of names associated with Bantu people who are the holders, the primary holders and spreaders of the quote unquote Negro archetype, because they basically break down the 3 key groups of Africans into the Cushitic, the Nilotic, which are the ones, the tall jokers along the Nile, and the Negro archetype, which is the Bantu. Bantu is a name that came much later from Ubuntu, but it is basically talking about this same lineage of the Ngoni, which also means sky people. So Zulu comes from Amazulu, children of the sky. And this particular archetype has been kicking y'all ass from day one, because we only think of sky as being the blue thing over our heads. But once you get into the older knowledge, you understand that the concept of sky, which is also the definition behind Anu, which we've come to understand to mean God or deity in Sumerian, it is more correctly Akasha. So you've heard probably of Akashic records, which is the vibratory record of all things that have been said and done, and it is everywhere. But Akasha also means space. This is a Sanskrit, so a Hindu Sanskrit word. It means space, sky, atmosphere. And so what distinguishes what we have going on here in this container of an atmosphere that allows us to have life on Earth versus what's happening in outer space, this is what we're talking about with Akasha. So Akasha is defined as, it can be used interchangeably with the word ether. So you've probably, if you are a fan of like Nuwapian stuff and whatever else you talk about with non-ether beings or whatever else, that's probably more accurate than you know. That is not an endorsement or denial of anybody or anything. But what I'm saying is the terminology that was used over there was actually very cleverly chosen and very carefully chosen. But anyway, so Akasha ether, what ether actually is the precursor to all the classical elements, which are the four archetypes of fire, water, air, and earth. Notice that I said archetypes because we are not talking about literal earth, literal fire, literal water, literal air, but the concepts associated with each of those archetypes are the foundations of what end up becoming the physical manifestations of those four things. Now, as I'm saying four, you might even notice that this symbol down here is divided into four, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. But the most important thing to understand is that sky, when you hear it in all of these religions, all of these mythologies, what it is actually talking about is Akasha. So you are an Akashic being. That means that what is you exists as a frequency. Akasha, the only attribute of the Akashic substance is sound. So sound, before it becomes audible, it already exists as a predetermined, I guess you could say, frequency address. It already has a predetermined form as a potential. And so when you use something that's called a cymatic plate, so cymatics is the science of taking a flat, it doesn't matter what shape it is, but they typically use like a circle or a square, and depending on which shape you use, it's going to determine what images appear. But just for the sake of this conversation, you take a circular thin metal plate and you send a single sound frequency through it, and on this plate we have like sand or dust or grain, like something really, really thin. And what'll happen is it'll form these patterns that look like mandalas or chakra symbols. Like it looks like this stuff because what it's doing is the sand is shifting and falling into the areas of the plate that are remaining still while sound moves through it. And so as these waves of sound move through it, it organizes these sands into patterns that we call cymatic patterns. And so within these patterns, you will find specific shapes and geometry associated with different frequencies. And so the frequency that is associated with your 5-point body, it creates something in Hindu thought, which is called the Shiva Panchakshar Yantra. Shiva Panchakshar Yantra. And in fact, I think since I have my laptop, I will also bring that up because that is a hell of a thing to say, and you can see why you don't know it. Because if you had to learn Sanskrit words over here in America, you wouldn't know shit right now. And it is hard enough to get kids to get off the tablet and learn something. Okay, so they have this version that has the yoni, but then the original form is what you understand to be a pentagram. But all that is arm, leg, arm, head, Allah. This is the template for your body. So this is what you can call the paternal aspect, the God aspect of your design. So the Y chromosome that you get from your daddy, that you get from the tadpoles when they are given to your mommy. One of the key functions that it serves is to regulate the SOX9 gene. The SOX9 gene, I hope you're writing this stuff down, is what determines your bilateral symmetry. So bilateral symmetry is the line that runs down your spine that makes your left half look like a mirror of the right half. Your daddy is the one that gives you that. Your daddy is the one that gives you this structure so that you don't end up with long arms like a Neanderthal, but instead get this proportioned golden ratio geometry of the pentagram in your body. So in other words, if you want to understand the masculine aspect when it comes to God and how it manifests within us, it is the template that exists before we have physical form. And you can think of your mother as providing the physical material that wraps around this template that you get from your father. So that's the easiest way to break that down. Okay. So that pancha, which means 5, is also the source of pintu, put, foot, Pangaea. All of those words are referring back to the same archetype, this same principle of this unfolding from the dot, which you can call a bindu, into the 5-point form. So they are one and the same. They are just different stages. And so you continue to evolve that word, you end up with Bantu. So all Bantu means is the final form. This is your Freezer final form transformation that is basically the template for all humans at the end of the day. All right, now let's get down here. I've got 2 words. One you might recognize a little better than the other. We have Yoah and Yahweh. So Yahweh, you know this to be a name of God, that comes from the Tetragrammaton, which is the 4-letter name of God. Yad He Vov He, which is not pronounced Jehovah because they did not have J's back then, and the Hebrew letter Vav is pronounced like a O. So it is actually pronounced something more similar to Yoah. Okay, so Yahweh is actually more correctly pronounced something along the lines of Yahweh or Yoah. Okay, why is this important? Because we have this thing called the Dikenga cosmogram in the Congo, which is also known as simply the Yoah, which basically tracks on the surface level the movement of the sun. Okay, so we start over here. So this line here is called the Kalunga line. Now, in addition to this tracking the movement of the sun, it also tracks the movement of you as a being through the physical world, through your physical development, and then into the spirit world, and then the process by which you re-enter through conception, develop in the womb, and then are born again. So these 4 ends also represent the 4 seasons. We have summer, fall, winter, spring. The summer, so you're emerging here. This is birth. The word for birth over here is Kala. And then if you know anything about Hindu teachings, Kala is also a name used for time and for Shiva. And in the famous quote by Oppenheimer before he blew everything up with his atomic bomb, he said, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, Hindu text, saying, I am become Kala, destroyer of worlds. So if you understand Kala in that context with time, and then you understand the African context of Kala in terms of your birth into the physical world, into the sun, your birth from the night into the sun, you can start piecing together how those people are connected back to us. But anyway, so this is your rise. This is your fall as you get older and mature. This is death, which is called Luvimba. And then you pass into the spiritual realm, and there's certain processes and things that happen here, and then you prepare for another incarnation if you have to. Now, that said, your goal is not to keep going around and around and around and around this thing. It is for you to understand the center so that you can escape the cycle. So for that reason, each one of these 4 points, in addition to representing the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, east, north, west, south, they also represent the 4 elements. So we've got fire over here. By the time you get to death, this is water over here. So we got fire and water on opposite ends of the spectrum here. And then, of course, you've got earth and air in juxtaposition here. But they all come together because at the center, this is what aligns with the ethos, being able to see all 4 aspects of yourself from a single point. And so that gets into a deep teaching about the way that we are able to, with our consciousness, move beyond the limitations of the local physical experience and then do the thing. Like what I'm about to describe, our ancestors, and then even people now more doing, like I've even been trained in how to do this. Once you know how to do it, it is almost as commonplace as walking to the kitchen and fixing a bowl of cereal. This is how commonly our ancestors did it. And if we knew anything about this, it would probably clear up a lot of the issues we have with remembering our history and everything else. But if you understand how to exit through the center, quote unquote, navel, then you are able to interact with your Akashic nature, your sky nature, and then be able to look at all of this from above. That doesn't necessarily have to mean literally from above physically. What I'm saying is to overstand. Y'all like to use that word, but this is the epitome of the concept of overstanding our nature. All right, so let's come over here to this side, and then I can wrap this shit up. All right, so you've got to get some key stuff into your vocabulary if you're ever going to escape this mental prison created by the confines of our current understanding as a result of our public school education. Okay, so let's start over here. So one thing that you'll find fascinating about the collective Proto-Bantu mythology, so all of it's a ton of different, like it's the most common group in Africa is the Bantu. All of us have some kind of connection to Bantu. Even the folks that left out of here came to the Americas. So if you're one of them people like we've been in the Americas, well, yeah, you Bantu too, or whatever, because you have to understand it conceptually and that it has nothing to do with simply your current geographic location, but by what was infused within you specifically before you migrated or did whatever you did. Okay. Now, you'll see that this, so in Nguni, we said that that's what's associated with this concept of the sky people. So Zulu and Nguni, that's all part of the same family here. This was actually the last step in the ladder. So before this, we had clans with like Eagle, Hawk, all those kind of names. In fact, you talk about the tribe of Shabazz, the word Shabazz in Persian actually deals with not exactly king or just Shah, but it's like it literally means crowned or royal hawk or royal eagle or royal kite, like just that phenotype of birds or whatever, those birds that fly highest and the birds of prey or whatever else. That's essentially what Shabazz means in Persian. And so if you connect that back to the Shiva 7 etymology that I explained in the beginning, the highest of your 7 faculties is the crown. The crown is not attached to your body. The crown chakra is everything above and beyond your head. So technically the atmosphere is part of your crown. But you concentrate it into what we call the Ori Inu. So The words Ori Inu, Orion, Uli and Inu in Igbo, even the word urine is contained in that same etymology because it's basically describing, it's associated but not completely encapsulated by a process. So there were several different ways that people were able to enact psychedelic or otherwise metaphysical experiences, and among those included the consumption of a specific mushroom that when it was digested and passed through the bladder where it is combined with uric acid, it would turn into a powerful psychedelic. So you had people that consumed that. So those were the piss drinkers. And then you start getting that more so when you get like towards Siberia. So all the Native Americans over here, at some point they passed through Siberia, and I will get into the receipts of that in another video because I found some fascinating things when it came to my own DNA. When you get past the commercial DNA test. So I'll just say this, that if you do like an ancestry DNA or whatever, like one of these commercial tests, it only accounts for the past 300 to 500 years. And if you are an African American, then that is pretty much just slave time. So you have no inkling of what happened before that. Now, the short version of the story with that is through sites like I think it's called GED Match. So GEDmatch.com. You can take your raw results from ancestry DNA, and then you can plug them into several tools that allow you to look at ancient DNA. There's one particular tool on there called Punt DNA. And mind you, this is an open source platform that was created by people just like me and you who may have gotten DNA results from a commercial site and wanted to know more about their deeper ancestry, especially if you have African ancestry. And so you have these tools. And so Punt DNA tool is specifically for looking at DNA that's 10,000 years or older. So if you want to be able to see the real story of where you come from, I broke it down stage by stage, allowing me to see how genes get classified. So in other words, something that may show up as you having a certain percentage of European in your blood, and then they might on the map show you like France and England, whatever else. In a commercial test, if you break that DNA down, the way that recombination works in DNA, that's $1 million word you can look up on your own time. If a population has had a certain type of DNA stable within its genome for hundreds, thousands of years, something like this, it stabilizes. And if another population comes along later where their DNA is mostly made up of just that portion that I described, your DNA results, instead of it saying that that DNA came from an ancient line, commercial tests will point to the new place where that DNA is, which would be like these countries like France and, Germany, wherever else. Now, what happened in looking at my DNA results was that, and the clue that gave it away was that my mother and father, despite having different backgrounds, they had nearly the exact same amount of European DNA. It's always this portion that's around like 12 or 13% or something like this. It can be as high as 20% in African Americans. But you will find that consistently across the board, we have this same mix or whatever, this same proportion. And what my results revealed was that this is actually coming from what they call ghost DNA. So there's a very, very old ancestor that was a shared ancestor between West Africans, which specifically I'm talking about Yoruba, Mande, Gambian, and Asan are the ones that showed up in my profile, and so there's other groups that are tied to those. So if I say Yoruba, that means you're bringing a lot of the Niger Congo in there. If I say Mande, that's going to bring Dogon, Mandinka, Fula, all of these into it. But the point is, each of these contain this quote unquote ghost DNA that is a common ancestor of the Gravettan culture, the Aurignacian culture, the Siberians that came across the land bridge into the Americas. So I know a lot of you like to hold on to this concept of us already being here, us being the Native Americans. But what I'm telling you is that it's even more amazing than that, is that the Native Americans resemble our original DNA. So what ended up happening here in the States is that as certain things were mixed and we moved around and even changed our relative position to the magnetic field lines of the earth, our DNA recombined back into something resembling the original state of all humanity. So it isn't a matter of you had to be the first people from a linear time standpoint. The fact of the matter is that you represent the archetypal form of humanity, which is a slightly lighter version of humanity than your African cousins on the continent right now. But you also contain the experience and the codes for every type of person on the planet. And as a result, the markings on your body reflect a more complete story of everybody on the planet. And this is why those teachings from Black Islam say that the black man of America, the lost found in the wilderness of North America, is God. Not because it makes you better than somebody, supreme over somebody, but based on the universal definition of the form, the word made flesh is you. But you still have to understand how that code is written on you for you to be of value and service to anybody else on this planet. But anyways, as I told you, from those eagle clan ancestors, or bird clan, whatever you want to call them, emerged the children of the sun. So this is one that you hear commonly, and the word for those ancestors were called the Kalanga. So Kalanga comes from a similar root to Kalunga, which is the spirit line. So just like I told you that this is the dawn, so this is dawn and this is dusk. So what they mean by that is that you were the first to rise into the physical world. So this is what the sun Kalunga is. You're the ones that cross the Kalunga line. That same root that gives us Naga and Nagar and all that is the root of the word night. Interestingly, it's related to Nut, the Egyptian goddess. And what that deals with is, so in the Sanskrit form of Naga, it also can refer to, in addition to a serpent, it also refers to an elephant. It refers to a human, because what it actually means is naked. So that G becomes a K and gives us the word naked. And it is referring to the smoothness of our skin. So unlike apes, unlike all kinds of other creatures, we have in common with both snakes and elephants that our skin is smooth. And then more specifically with the snake, we have melanin arrangements on our skin. We have markings. The back of your hand is not the same color as the front of your hand. And in the palm of your hand, it isn't just arbitrarily marked. It's marked specifically, especially on your fingers, it's marked relative to the golden ratio proportions of your finger joint. So there's no arbitrary reason as to why you have the markings on your body. Those are related to magnetic field lines within the body. They are similar to the magnetic field lines of the earth itself because you're based on the same template. Okay. So that's what makes you sun people. So because you have dark surface, you melanin, you are able to take advantage of the paramagnetic properties of your melanin, and your melanin will orient its magnetic field according to incoming electromagnetic fields, aka the sunlight. So you're like a plant, your melanin, the materials within it actually face the direction that the sun is shining on you. So it will do different things based on what time of day it is. It will do different things based on what location you are in on the globe. I see Babalawo's in here, Alafia. I know you recognize that symbol right there. All right, and so from the sun people, you get who are called the little sons, aka princes. And so if you know a little thing about Hebrew, the word nun, which is the 14th letter, corresponds to our letter N. It can mean prince or fish, but in Egyptian, it refers to the primordial waters or the primordial vibrations. And so essentially what it's describing is the process by which those primordial waves give rise to physical matter, and you are both the wave from which you come from and the physical form that you use to perceive those waves. So the fish and the water are one in that framework. And so that's what these people were. So once you had the physical body that's able to interact with the sun and arrange the DNA, you had the little sons who have that information stored in the body. So I'll get into what that means in a moment. What does it mean that you have a little sun inside your body? On a surface level, one of the easiest ways to describe that is you have something called circadian rhythm. So whereas as a creature on this planet, your cycles and everything else were organized by the sunlight and the different things in the sky, women are still like this because women basically developed first, and then men, we were born through them. So when we talk about the original man, we're talking about the first male that was born through the first completely finished human woman. All right. And so anyway, so you come through there and then you contain this information within you now, because whereas her body was regulated by these cycles of the sun and moon, you are now able to have internal rhythms of when you eat, sleep, wake up, all of this stuff as part of your metabolism. You can call that your inner clock or your inner sun. So what used to be something that allowed us to map what was happening with the sun outside of ourselves became a way for us to map what's going on inside ourselves. And then this is going to give rise to our African divination systems like Ifa, Afa, and Afa, or whatever variations of that you want to look at. Okay. And so from the point of recognizing that, you ended up having the wildcat ancestors. And so for our intents and purposes, those will be the leopard. As we moved out of Africa, you started to see this become more associated with things like lions and tigers, because there's tigers in Asia instead of lions like you have in Europe. And then instead of just those, you have a collection of leopards and lions and all sorts of things on the African continent. But the key archetype that connects everything is leopard, and that's why I went through the trouble of writing The Leopard in the Mirror, Canticle of the Mutant Guardian, available on Amazon. But the leopard symbolism that is associated with secret societies, from the Sim priest of Egypt all the way up to the Ekpe of Nigeria, or whatever, the significance of the leopard is that the way that a leopard gets its ring-like spots called rosettes. The way that it gets those follows the same process by which we get these markings on our palm. And we have rings around our fingers that are essentially the same thing as leopard rosettes, and it outlines our destiny. You can look at those rosettes as a flattened toroid. So a toroid is basically the shape we associate with a donut. But this is the way that light, this is the form that light takes when it transitions energy in plasma form. So plasma is the word for the state of matter that we associate with fire, the sun, lightning, and electricity. All of that is essentially plasma. And so plasma takes this donut shape in order to translate light energy into sound energy. Okay, and then this is where we get our first written languages. So when you look at Nsibidi in Nigeria, when you look at even the Hebrew fire letters, these are derived from specific positions of a toroidal donut plasma field. And so that if you understand that concept, that is essentially what was understood by the early creators of computers and things here in the Americas or whatever. They got this knowledge straight from the African continent. And so once you move down from the wildcat ancestors, then we get the general concept of the Nguni, who are the general name that you can associate with anybody who has a story about us descending from the sky people and all of this or whatever. It's not simply sky, but akasha. So the very substance, the very substrate that carries vibration and sound through the universe, that's where we come from or whatever. That frequency is that first, and then we apply that to physical material in the universe, and then over billions of years we're able to make a stable body for ourselves and consciously recognize ourselves and stand up and say, oh, I remember now, I'm God. I just went through this whole process of forgetting and remembering. Okay, which brings me over here, the coup de grace. Here's the science and the math, the receipts that bring all of this together. So there's this concept called Meru Prastar. I've talked about this in previous videos. What this refers to, if you were in math class, is Pascal's triangle. So Pascal's triangle is this thing where you take one, it just looks like some arbitrary shit that you do in class and you're never going to use again, but I'm here to tell you this is the center of all existence. So 1 becomes 2. So in order for the unmanifest God to be able to experience itself, it has to split into 2. You end up getting that as the Adam and Eve story. So before they were kicked out of the garden, they were not even in physical existence. This is representing the differentiation between the masculine and the feminine aspect of one being. So that is what you are as a human being. You have the masculine and the feminine aspect that has nothing to do with sex or gender. It's to say that the masculine deals more with the spiritual unmanifest aspect, the information, the ether, the template. The feminine deals mostly with the physical, material aspect of the self. And so by combining these two things, it gives rise to everything else. So if you know your supreme mathematics, you know you've got knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom is defined as the manifestation of knowledge. So in order for us to have a physical manifestation of the information that is associated with the Father, we first have to go through this differentiation process, and then it borns a manifestation. So it's right there encoded. So once the 1 splits into the 2, we get these other numbers by adding together. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. These ones are going to come all the way down. They're forming the sides of the mountain. So Meru in Hindu thought is it's the mountain that emerged from the primordial sea. That was the home or abode for the gods from which everything else was created. And so Meru is also a word that is applied to the pyramid, but more importantly, it means, so Melu, MRW, is used as a word for desert in Egyptian, and that is where the pyramid is located. So it's the desert from which the mountain emerges, from which the pyramid emerges. The pyramid is not just that thing you see in Giza. You are the pyramid, and you'll understand that by the time I'm done. You were the pyramid before you even had a physical body. But once again, you will understand it by the time I'm done. Now, prostara is connected to that word prostrate I talked about earlier. So it doesn't just mean to bow before something. It means you are the spreading out of that thing. And so Meru Prostara is literally a mountain that spreads out from a single point. All right. So all these things that we've been describing is this concept of you being a single point, your cells multiplying until you reach a form that looks like that. That's how everything in the universe works. It's using the same math to do that. Okay. And so you see, I have done that out to 9 total lines. So in Pascal's triangle, aka Meru Prostara, and I'll distinguish between those two in a moment. We call that top line line 0 because that's the origin point. 0 origin point represents Akasha in the original numeral system of the Vedas. So whenever you hear about a point or 0, it's talking about space. It's talking about ether. It's talking about Akash. And then that's why it unfolds here to a 5-point form. The 5th chakra is the throat chakra. And then that is where we unfold sound from the Akasha into a physical form that we can hear. So that's the underlying concept behind all of that. Now, so that being line 0, if I unfold this 9 lines, that brings us to line 8, which would be our base. Now, you can keep on going forever, but as far as our existence go, this whole concept of us being 9 ether is associated with these 9 lines right here. Okay, so Dr. York wasn't just talking a bunch of crazy stuff, even though some of it wasn't broken down enough for the average person to get. It isn't rooted in bullshit. I'll tell you that right now. Okay. And then this ain't just some stuff I just got from him or whatever. This stuff I figured out on my own, and then I realized, oh, he's saying the same stuff. So that's got to count for something. So why is this even important? Okay, aside from it being the source of the Bible, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so if you convert these to letters, so into Semitic letters, all right, so we'll start here. Then I won't even get into the Trinity here and the Ka and all of that. But ABA is Abba. That's the word for father. So then this gives you a precedent for the story of Abraham and in his lineage. All right. If I take all of these, first letter is A, 11. I can take this, make an 11. It'll be K, A, B, A. Akaba, which is the Yoruba word for ladder or staircase, which is the same definition of the word that's used for Jacob's ladder in the story. Here, this 3-3 would correspond to CC. And I think I want to show you this one, because I don't want you just hanging on my word for this particular one, because this is one of the grandest discoveries, in my personal opinion, of anything that I've found out. Okay, so if I go here, the CC on my etymology site, and then I go down here to the Terrafit. Okay, so you'll see that CC transliterates into a pre-proto-verb. So before the before. So before North Africans was light-skinned, and yes, that Atye root is tied to Atlantis, but we won't get into that. And Atlas is tied to Atlantis. We won't get into that. So we basically getting into Atlantean stuff. So yeah, the quote-unquote Atlanteans are you before you got here on physical Earth. But that's for another conversation. But anyway, so you see this CC looking thing here or whatever. So this is pronounced either ch or sh. So, and what this word means. Okay, so among other meanings, the ones that we want to really look at are to usurp and to be hairy. Now, I don't know if you recognize that, but to usurp is the definition or the name meaning of Jacob. And the name meaning of Esau is to be hairy. So not only are they twins in a story, they are 2 twin meanings of the same word that corresponds to this 3-3. So we literally have the Jacob meaning usurping the Esau meaning when we consider this along with this Akaba, which meant ladder, so that all of this becomes Jacob's ladder. Okay, now descending from Jacob is the house of David, and this is the house from which Jesus is supposed to emerge. If we convert these to Hebrew letters, that'll be Dalet, Vav, Dalet, which is the Semitic root for David, which means beloved. Mary, coming from Egyptian, it's pronounced the same way, Mary, but it's spelled M-R-Y or M-R-J, also means love or beloved. So this is how Mary comes from the house of David. Okay, and the reason this 4-6-4 combination is important is because it is also the proportions of the points, lines, and surfaces on a tetrahedron. So a tetrahedron is that triangular 3D shape, which is the most basic 3D shape. So in other words, when we're talking about Jesus being the Word made flesh, it is also a geometry lesson, because now I can, with this shape, I can draw a tetrahedron. Matter of fact, let me do that for you. Y'all got that, so oh my. So if I draw, making this triangle, oops, and then I'm doing this without looking at the actual. I'm looking at the camera instead of the actual board, so excuse my sloppiness. Okay, and if I do all of this right here to make that into a 3D shape, so tetrahedron. Okay. So my ability to make a tetrahedron is actually supported by the point in this mathematical recursion where I can actually draw a tetrahedron. So the tetrahedron is also the Platonic solid, the symbol used for fire by the Greeks. And the element of fire deals with will and so your ability to actually interact with the physical world. So we had the car up here, so 1, 1, 11, 1 is 1, so we can make that a K and a A, which is the personality part. So this is the part you know of yourself, the part you project out into the world. Here we have at the end of Akaba. So remember, Akaba by itself can mean hand or spirit. And then we have the Ba. So the Ba is the part of the part of you that remains in the spirit world at the bottom of the Kalunga line. And it is what you become when you are an ancestor. So you are a God that who, depending on your coherence between your Ba and your Ka, to awaken your Ach or Kaaba, which can also mean cube. So with these same letters, you can spell Kaaba like the Kaaba in Mecca. Depending on the coherence of your understanding of these things I'm telling you now, it will determine how well you're able to act on the physical world and assist your descendants when they consult upon you as an ancestor. And this is why the word ancestor was used synonymously with gods in Africa, not because they were trying to make their ancestors gods, but then essentially you're returning back to the state that is closer to your original source state and are therefore able to act on behalf of your descendants from there. But it all depends on the activities that you performed before you died, as well as the activities that your descendants continue to do in order to make your signal more stronger and able to translate through them and certain materials and stuff for you to be able to act on the physical world. So it's not just some voodoo stuff or whatever. It's an actual science behind this, and I'll get it even more into the scientific language of it. But for the most part, you need to understand that I could keep on going forever, but this is essentially where all of your stories for the Bible, where the Vedas, even the Quran, they talk about the hidden book of the Quran, and then Noble Drew Ali even talks about this. The Torah before the creation, all of this is associated with this. Now, what does this have to do with your black ass? You may be asking. And this is the bombshell out of all of it. Okay, so if you notice, I happen to circle the numbers that appear in the middle of it. So you'll notice that on each side of this thing, it has symmetry. So y-axis symmetry, just like your body, where you have a left side and a right side, and it's reflected on both sides. So this is a template of your body. Okay, and if we look at this as your spine, okay, right in the middle, this would be the heart. But if we're looking at this as your spine, we got 5 numbers that appear right in the middle of this thing. I was just playing around one day, and I realized that the gematria, so the gematria is something in with Hebrew letters where each letter has a number value. And so the letter values that this would correspond to are Aleph, Bet, Vov, Kaf, Ayin. Transliterating, which means to change it, not just simply translate it, but to write it out the way it would be written in English. This would correspond to E-B-O-K-A, which spells Eboka. Eboka is the Fong Bantu spelling of Iboga, which is a herb that is used in Central Africa, particularly in Gabon, one of the places I named, one of those radioactive places, that is used to basically allow you to have not necessarily an out-of-body experience. It's similar to it, but it is better described as an inner-body experience, where you actually interface with your own ancestry and receive information. So this is something that is used in its drug form, which is ibogaine, as a highly reliable way to defeat opioid addiction. So iboga is used to overcome opioid addiction, and like we're talking about results of like 85% or better with this. And this is one of the best kept secrets. So that people been, rich white folks been flying over to Africa, kicking their opioid addictions by taking this iboga plant. Now, it is nothing like ayahuasca or any other stuff that you want to try to associate with this, because whereas all of those other forms kind of take you out of yourself so that you can interact with other entities or whatever else, this and the majority of the African framework are designed for you to have a direct line to source. So every one of them stories about Jesus, whatever else, this idea of going within and connecting through Christ, they made it into a single man, but it's actually the underlying structure of the entire universe. And if you get more into the biblical descriptions of the logos, even in the descriptions by Paul or whatever, where they talk about the pre-existent form of Christ before you get into this idea of a man, all of that does this, where it goes within and interacts with the inner son instead of trying to get out of the body, because the instructions are written within you. But where at within you? And this is the fun part. This is the true origin of Black God, and why you are the living instructions, why you are the living word. So we've got a couple concepts here. So the first thing we want to look at is a Peratt instability. You've never heard this in your life, I know, because they didn't teach it in school. There's just some cool shit I had to end up learning over time. But I'm going to go to YouTube for you right now, So you don't have to, but you can on your own time, because don't do your own research alone. You can use it as a verification tool for those of us who have discovered things and want to share it with you. Oh, I spelled that wrong. It's not Pratt, it's Parrot. Come on, computer. Get with it now. We're doing something here. So Parrot instability. As you can see, I've already been looking at it recently. Okay. Let me see. Where's so that's your dude right there. That's Parrot right there. Now, without me having to click on too much, you can kind of see in the screenshots here. But so in laboratories, they have these very expensive, very high power plasma generator things where they send all this energy, all this light energy in there. They condense the gases, and it's a bunch of technical stuff. But the point is, once you send enough energy through plasma, it starts forming. You see this right here where it kind of looks like a spine right here. Well, it always forms. I don't want to watch it. They trick me. I don't need your mess right now. But anyway, it forms these structures that keep showing up in rock glyphs and stuff as this character they call the stick man. And he normally has like 2 dots on his side. So sometimes you see him without it, but a lot of times you'll see it with these 2 dots on it. And what you're actually looking at is a Parrot instability, which is something that happens as large plasma emissions from like the sun or from space, when they come into our atmosphere. And that's what when you see like aurora borealis, which they call like the northern lights, you have them in the south too, by the South Pole. But those auroras, they take these forms, and then I'll bring it up on Google so you can see the pictures a little better, where they take these shapes that actually look like birds and people and any number of things. And then you can see here how like these different cave arts and things. And then I like this one because this actually resembles the Zulu crowns that the women wear, like how Queen Ramonda has on the Black Panther movies. And so the Zulu, being located down in South Africa, they would have had a great view of the northern lights in Antarctica from their location, and from where they're standing, it would have looked something like this. Okay, because you're seeing it from a different angle. And so you'll see like the stick man with the 2 dots, he's basically this form right here. So this is the form that the plasma takes in between links or whatever, and it takes it makes this like spine looking design, and it always has 9 of them. And as the energy increases, these donuts, you can see those little donut forms, they become kind of flattened out like the rings of a leopard pattern, and these start to fold at the end, the 2 at the end. So there's 9 of these. They fold at the end and start to look like flowers. And so this is where you get a lot of the lotus imagery in religions. If you look at this thing from above, it has this concentric thing or whatever. And when you cut, so this has 56 at most. It ends up getting up to 56 fibers, if you will. And then I just want you to go ahead and notice that on our base of our 9 lines of Meru Prostara or Pascal's triangle, you start getting that number 56, because that's a stabilizing number. So these numbers aren't just arbitrary, but they're the most efficient way for energy to transform from unmanifest to physical. If you look up plasmoids and plasma and all of that on YouTube, you'll see a lot of stuff about how when enough energy is flowing through these plasma clouds, they start to behave just like organic life. So it's like, so in other words, all the things that we associate with life on our planet, they're already worked out, at least archetypically, in ionic gas before it ever, becomes contained in a body like yours. So your spine and more importantly, the electricity in your spine is basically following this exact same template where the energy, once it reaches a certain point, the wave starts to collapse on itself and create what they call a Z pinch. So that Z pinch forms this narrow column in the middle. And so essentially that's what the electricity in your spine is. It's essentially a Z pinch. Okay. And in Hindu thought, that Z pinch, which is essentially your inner sun, they refer to it as Sushumna. So they call it the Sushumna Nadi. So you've got two main channels that carry energy in your body, which they refer to as Ida and Pingala. Interestingly enough, in India, the guy that they say discovered Meru Prastara, his name is Pingala. So I already know that that is actually a metaphor of Pingala discovering Meru Prastara, because Pingala is the male aspect, and I already described to you what the male aspect is. It's our template. So that's just some funny business over there. All right, so anyway, so Sushumna is the middle. So you can look at Sushumna as the child of the winding double helix serpent of the masculine and feminine energy channels around the spine. And so when those are balanced through a process we call Shambhavi Mahamudra, it was a 6-month initiation I had to go through. I had to do this practice every day, twice for the first 3 months, and then at least once every day for the 3 months after that. What it does is it aligns those energies so that your conscious focus can interact with your central nervous system. You're already doing that. So this isn't just mystical stuff. You're already interacting with your central nervous system by having a brain in the first place. What this does is it aligns your focus with the center of that central nervous system, where that plasma is more focused. And one of the cool things about plasma is that it has what is called non-local behavior. So in other words, it is able to communicate in wave form with all plasma in the universe. That sounds crazy, but it is science. Your children are paying thousands of dollars in Yale and Harvard to learn about what I'm telling you right now. But what I'm saying to you is, all the way back here, our ancestors figured out how to access this thing, even if the language that they were using to describe it wasn't meant to be descriptive in the way that our English language is. It is meant to preserve the information. That's why it's in myths and symbols. Okay. But anyways, what happens during the OBE is that you're tapping into this same principle. However, depending on the understanding that you have of scripture and words and language, how you experience this information is going to be drastically restricted by the coherence of your understanding with the actual structure of the universe. If you run into, so you have this aspect, so your divine spark, we refer to that as the chi in Odinala. And so the chi is the central divine spark that is connected directly to source, that you are able to interface with and then find out all the information you want to know about yourself, about your ancestors, about anything going on in the universe. Whenever people are talking about trying to get out of their body, or they're talking about communicating with other spirits, or they're talking about communicating with aliens, I don't care what it is. Anytime they're talking about trying to communicate with something that's separate from themselves, that means that their understanding is based on separateness, not unity. And as a result, they will experience beings who may be intelligent because they've been around a long time, but they won't have access to all knowledge because they only know as much as, they've been able to accumulate in the time that they've been around. They're still trying to figure out things just like you are. However, if you understand how to communicate and tap into your own divine spark, you have a direct line to source, but you are limited by your capacity to process that information. So the process of actually even doing these types of things involves two key processes. There's two key concepts, and you can get there any number of ways, but it involves one, in training the hemispheres of the brain. So you have a left side and a right side that do not communicate directly, but then they have a way to bridge each other. And so essentially there are practices designed, usually sound based, that allow the two hemispheres of the brain to act as one. So that's the first key concept, because that's what ends up allowing you to interact with the middle. And, you know, in the middle is all the fun stuff like the pineal gland and the spinal cord and all of that. Once you have a process like that, you can look up binaural beats. These are just frequencies that are created by two different stereo frequencies. So you'll need headphones for these. But by those two frequencies combining, your brain puts it together as one signal, the same way that 3D glasses put two different images together in order for you to see one 3D picture. All right, so that's going to be essential for you to be able to see what's happening on the other side. Then you have to increase your electrolyte intake. So the real reason why that process involved them drinking piss with the psychedelics they had is because you have electrolytes, specific electrolytes that are found in your pee, and among those is solomonium. So this is where we get the word Solomon, the name Solomon. This is where so that Amun in there is the same as Amun in Egypt, the hidden one. And so all in all, what they're describing with Amun, Ammon, all of that is the hidden one within the electricity in your body, which is why it's associated with Zeus. So the same thing that's happening with the lightning and plasma in the atmosphere is happening within you on a smaller scale. And so you don't need to reach out to nothing outside yourself, because everything that's happening in the universe is happening inside you too, scientifically speaking. All right. So anyway, so we got this process. Now, what is this Blaschko line things here? Now, this is something I actually just learned about relatively recently. So apparently melanin in your body, when it gets ready to, you know, spread out and whatever else, your body releases hormones in a very specific way, concentrating it all in one particular point, and then it sends these signals out through the body in a process that looks just like this before it emerges on the surface. And so when it does this, the path that these hormones and the melanocyte cells take to do this as they spread out prostera, it leaves these markings called Blaschko lines. Right here, it's named after some dude named Blaschko. But they're called Blaschko lines. We do not see them because the dark melanin on your skin covers it up. Similarly, a black panther, which is just a melanated form of a leopard or jaguar, still has spots on its coat. Like if you were to shave it and then look at its skin, you can see it even closer. But it still has spots, but they are concealed or hidden, like almond, by their black fur. Similarly, your dark skin covers your Blaschko lines. So you didn't even realize these were here. You didn't even realize it was doing this exact thing. But this is the original form of the Torah. So as opposed to it appearing as numbers like I have written here, it appears as relative positions. So the lines are going to be spaced out just like this right here. And so over time of studying this, if you understand the relative positioning of things, when you create a symbolic system to represent each of those points, you can lay those out, and then this becomes the scaffolding for your Semitic languages, any language that has a math basis underneath it. And then that includes all languages, because whether you're the language that developed directly from this right here, or you're a language that developed from a language that developed from a language that developed from this, the DNA is still in there because we have a holographic universe and a holographic existence. So this thing right here exists in every single language, every alphabet system, and more importantly, in every person's body. However, it is more pronounced in people with skin like mine, because you can actually see which lines, which proportions. Every measurement system in the old world was based on these proportions of our body, our palm and our arm. That's where the cubit comes from. And all of that, when you hear about the cubit or whatever they call it in the Bible, that's where it comes from. But case in point, all this together, if you missed any part of it, go back and review. When we say, and I'm turning the camera back around here so you can hear me clearly. When we say the black man is God, whose proper name is Allah, arm, leg, arm, head, it is not meant to be on some religious shit, but it is meant to encode the science of everything that I've shown you right here. And you can see how that could cause confusion. Because whereas we understand it because we went through the training, we went through the initiation, we studied those lessons, and we can put it in a rap song. I could sit up here and be like, my flow is high explosive as I travel the sky. No, as I shatter the sky. Things of that nature, I get into the sky nature. Mastermind, magnifying glasses couldn't classify the subatomic masses as I cut them into fraction size. As I break it down into these numbers. But I'd rather pass the time writing classic lines than always clashing with the kind that's blind. The 85, that's 85% of the globe. The 85 knows that it rains, hail, snows, been shown, but still remain in hell froze, just ice cold. So they're frozen in an earthly understanding of what the sky is. So you can encode that in raps. You can use 5% of terminology or whatever, but unless you have knowledge yourself, you can't decode it and then figure all of this stuff out. But it's embedded in our bodies. So it's not just something to make somebody a little better than somebody else. It's not to say that you are God the way that most people understand it, but to actually clarify what it always was intended to mean. That said, the concept of devil, the word of which comes from to throw across or to pierce, is basically just describing the state that happens when we move further away from the equator where we became dark. We become light enough for the sun to penetrate or pierce the skin, damage or mutate the DNA, and cause us to mutate in various ways until we had the adaptation near the equator that allows us to stabilize. And so, whereas we associate that dynamic of God and devil within the context of Black Islam with Black people versus white people, it is not a superficial explanation with regard to racial undertones, but it's to say that the state that each of us are in today comparatively is a result of the entropy or deterioration of our understanding of the original scripture. This is called chaos theory. So you see how it starts simple and it just starts to get increasingly more complex as things go. That is exactly what happened with us. As we spread out, as our language spreads out, our understanding of these simple stories becomes more complicated, more complex. We tell the story with different language and different words. And the next thing you know, you've got white people saying that we had the curse of Ham and became black because we were cursed. And then they use that as a justification to make us servants, because that whole God messenger type of thing that started out as so at least when it comes to the secret societies with the Ekpe, you had messengers, Nzes, who were given specific markings, which is where eagle wings actually come from, interestingly enough. That's where that concept comes from. Or they were given two palm fronds to hold, so you can see how that's more like wings. But the point is that everybody understood that these people were important and they were not to be touched. So as they moved from village to village, nobody bothered them because they were delivering messages from one branch of the secret society to another. And these secret societies, they were the ones who helped maintain law and order. And as long as these systems were used in their proper way, they were extremely useful for organizing and making successful societies. However, later down the line during the slave trade, you did have people who abused these particular privileges and use their judicial system to send some of their own people into slavery. The people, like when you talk about like we use this term servant of the court. So like different attorneys or whoever else, we call them servants of the court, or clerks, we call them servants of the court. They're not slaves in the court. You understand that. But this same concept of judges, messengers, all of that, it ends up in the Bible in a way to where those people who can't check the scripture against their own bodily markings end up interpreting that to mean that the people who were responsible for maintaining the temples, the people who were responsible for translating the text, the people who were given immunity because of their association with those duties for the people, they were instead made out to be a caste of people who are seen as slaves. They weren't slaves to you. They were servants of the temple. And that confusion right there is why we can't get ahead in the Americas right now. Not even the act of slavery itself, but the fact that we're still enslaved to the entropic, chaotic, complex, deteriorated meanings of teachings that precede creation itself, as opposed to being able to trace the trail back to where we were all one. And that is why we put so much emphasis on the original man. Like I got my 7 shaver right there, Shabazz, all that I explained earlier. But at the same time, I got this joint on right here, which is a Shiva Lingam. Because at the end of the day, that's all you are. The same thing that is what you are in terms of a form that holds a standing wave in a very specific way that allows information to be retrieved if you match the resonance of your body using sound to the resonance of that object. It's just a way of storing information, y'all. That's all it is. But this has been a good one, a long one. I ain't going to be doing another one of these for some time. This video will delete itself automatically after 29 or 30 days, according to Facebook. So if you need to, watch it, rewatch it. If there's something you don't understand due to specialized context, you can always go grab my book, The Leopard in the Mirror, Canticle of the Mutant Guardian, on Amazon. If you're still confused after that, you can always find yourself an enlightener and then get the knowledge of self for yourself. Get that supreme alphabet, that supreme mathematics. Not everybody's going to be God. Not everybody wants that responsibility of knowing. But at the very least, you can be civilized. And that doesn't mean to force somebody to live the way you're living. What it means is there is a certain way that we can cultivate peace that was pre-established before we screwed all this up. And on that note, I'm the Emma. Peace.